There's a pivotal shift that happens before anything on the outside changes, before the text comes, before the apology, before the return. There is a moment, a sacred, soul-awakening moment, when you change first. This moment isn't loud, it's not flashy, it's not a performance, it's a quiet internal revolution where you finally stop asking, will they come back, and start asking, who am I becoming through this? This is the transformation that changes everything. Because before anyone comes back to your life, you have to come back to yourself. You have to reclaim the parts of you that got buried under overgiving, overthinking, and overextending. You have to rise, not to be noticed, not to win someone back, but because staying stuck is no longer an option. The moment this change happens in you, the entire energy of your life shifts. Let's break down the 6 key changes that happen in you first, before any return, any message, or any external validation appears. These are the inner shifts that make you magnetic, empowered, and untouchable in the most beautiful way. You stop seeking validation and start trusting your worth. And that's the moment your power returns. There was a time you looked outside yourself for signs that you were lovable enough, worthy of staying for. You'd analyze texts, replay conversations, and hang your hope on how someone else treated you. You tried to earn their attention, to prove your value by overgiving, overexplaining, and overcompensating. But in that process, you lost connection with the one person whose validation actually matters most, your own. When you stop seeking validation, you begin hearing your own voice again. The noise quiets. The need to be seen becomes less important than the need to see yourself clearly. You realize that if someone didn't recognize your worth, it wasn't because it wasn't there, it's because they weren't capable of seeing it. You start understanding that their blindness doesn't define your brilliance. That shift is monumental, because the moment you stop tying your worth to how someone responds to you is the moment you become emotionally free. It starts slowly. You stop rereading old messages looking for meaning. You stop checking their status to see if they're thinking about you. You stop dressing for their reaction and start dressing for your reflection. You begin showing up in spaces with quiet confidence, not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because you're finally impressed by the person you're becoming. You feel the difference in your bones, no more trying to be chosen. You realize you were the prize all along. This shift doesn't mean you become cold or detached. It means you become self-sourced. Your confidence no longer rises and falls based on how someone treats you. Your emotions aren't dictated by their presence or absence. You become your own anchor, rooted in a deep understanding that you are worthy of love, not because of what you do or how you're seen, but because of who you are at your core. And that energy is magnetic. Something powerful happens when a person trusts their worth. They stop tolerating breadcrumbs. They stop chasing people who pull away. They stop performing for attention. They no longer need to be chosen to feel enough. They are enough, and that kind of energy doesn't beg, it attracts. That kind of presence doesn't chase, it invites. You begin moving from a place of inner alignment rather than emotional lack, and people feel that shift, even if they can't explain it. Suddenly, the person who once felt distant may start leaning in, not because you demanded it, but because you detached from the need for it. And that's the paradox. When you stop seeking validation, that's when it often comes. Not because you manipulated it, but because you've stopped needing it to breathe. You've become someone who's emotionally self-sufficient, and that makes you irresistible, not just to others, but to yourself. You start looking in the mirror and finally seeing what was always there, a whole, worthy, powerful human being who doesn't need to be completed, only respected. You disconnect from the past version of yourself, and suddenly everything begins to make sense. The person you were, the one who tolerated mixed signals, stayed quiet to keep the peace, questioned her worth in someone else's hands. That version served a purpose, but she is not who you are anymore. She was built in survival mode. She made decisions from fear, from scarcity, from the belief that love had to be earned through sacrifice. And now, with everything you've been through, you begin to feel the pull to shed her, not out of shame, but out of evolution. This isn't about waking up one day and becoming someone brand new. It's about realizing you've outgrown the emotional patterns that kept you in cycles of self-abandonment. You start to notice how often you used to shrink your voice to be accepted, how often you twisted yourself into someone else's version of enough. You see it clearly now, and you're not angry, you're aware. That awareness becomes your freedom, because now you're not reacting out of habit, you're choosing from truth. The moment you disconnect from that past version of you is the moment you step into emotional leadership. You start to show up differently, not just with others, but with yourself. You no longer feel the need to prove your worthiness through someone else's attention. You don't chase closure. You don't beg to be seen. You stop letting memories dictate your self-image. You stop waiting for someone to remember your value and start remembering it yourself. There's a softness to this transformation, but don't confuse it with weakness. It's the softness that comes with strength. You now walk away not because you don't care, but because you care too much about your peace. You no longer argue to be understood. You observe, you detach, you choose stillness over struggle. You've stopped trying to control outcomes and started trusting your instincts. You know when to lean in and when to let go. That wisdom came from the pain, but it also came from the rising. The truth is that old version of you was necessary. She helped you survive, she kept you going, she held on even when she should have let go. But you're not her anymore, and that's a good thing. You're no longer emotionally available for the kind of love that requires you to betray yourself. You've stopped romanticizing inconsistency, and you've started craving alignment. You know now that if it costs you your peace, it's too expensive, and that level of awareness, that level of self-honor, that's the change that comes before anything else returns. When you disconnect from who you were, you create space for who you are becoming. You stop mourning the past and start building a future rooted in self-respect. You look in the mirror and see someone different, not because they left, but because you finally came back to you. You begin to guard your energy like it's sacred, because for the first time, you realize that it truly is. You recognize that the way you feel, the way you think, and the way you show up in the world are all directly connected to what and who you allow into your space. In the past, you may have given too much, your time, your presence, your emotional bandwidth, to people who didn't truly honor it. Not because you were weak, but because you were trying to prove your value through how much you could give. Now that changes. You begin to understand that energy is a currency, and if you're constantly spending it on situations that drain you, there's nothing left for what feeds your growth. So you stop engaging in conversations that lead nowhere. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. You stop giving multiple chances to patterns that keep repeating. You stop being so emotionally available to anything or anyone that makes you question yourself. Worth. That's not pettiness, it's protection. You're not closing yourself off. You're closing the door to chaos, confusion, and codependency. Suddenly, peace becomes the new standard. You start asking, how does this interaction make me feel afterward? Rather than, will they be okay with what I said or did? You become less reactive. You no longer feel the need to prove your side, win the argument, or force the connection. You've tasted inner stillness, and now you guard it with your life. The person who once lived in emotional overdrive now chooses softness, slowness, and discernment. That is power. You're not being cold. You're being conscious. There's a difference. You're conserving your energy so that it can be poured into people, places, and practices that uplift you. You start choosing environments where you're not just tolerated but celebrated. You start building boundaries not to keep people out, but to keep yourself aligned, and those boundaries, they're not walls, they're filters. They help you stay connected to your truth while protecting you from distractions that dilute your purpose. What changes most is your relationship with yourself. You no longer betray your own feelings just to keep the peace. You don't override your intuition to avoid conflict. You listen closely to your body, your spirit, your nervous system. If something feels off, you honor that. You no longer ignore red flags. You address them with clarity or walk away without drama. That emotional maturity radiates. It tells the world, I'm not available for chaos anymore. When you begin to guard your energy like it's sacred, others feel it. They either rise to meet your new standard or fall away, and either outcome is a blessing, because the version of you that used to overextend herself for love has been replaced by someone who embodies love, peace, and self-respect. And from that space, the energy that once scattered now becomes focused, strong, and magnetic, not because you're trying to be wanted, but because you're finally aligned with your worth. You align your actions with your healing, not your hurt, and that changes everything. At first, it's easy to act from a place of pain, to react, to prove, to post things that are secretly messages, to say words you don't fully mean, just to stir emotion or reclaim a false sense of control. Hurt wants a reaction, hurt wants revenge, hurt wants to be seen even if it's messy, but healing wants peace, healing chooses stillness over chaos, healing doesn't need attention to feel worthy, it creates its own validation from within. When you start aligning your actions with healing, you move differently. You stop reaching out just because silence feels uncomfortable. You stop posting stories to get noticed. You stop responding out of emotional habit. Instead, you start pausing. You give yourself space to ask, am I doing this because I've grown or because I'm triggered? And that awareness becomes your superpower because you're no longer just reacting to your emotions. You're consciously choosing how you want to live and love. This shift isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about learning that you don't need to prove you've moved on. You don't need to win the breakup. You don't need them to know you're okay. Why? Because your peace is no longer dependent on whether or not someone understands your journey. You're not trying to perform healing anymore. You're living it. And when you live your healing, people notice the difference, not because you're louder, but because you're calmer, not because you're in their face, but because you've finally left the emotional battlefield. Every time you want to act from hurt, send that impulsive message, bring up the past, guilt them into remembering your worth, you stop, not because you're weak, but because you realize healing doesn't need to shout. Healing is silent strength. You take a breath, you journal instead of arguing, you talk to someone who supports your growth, you go for a walk, you pray, you reflect, you channel that energy inward. That's alignment. That's emotional discipline, and that's where your power lives. What begins to emerge is a version of you who doesn't need to retaliate to feel powerful, a version of you who sets boundaries without needing to justify them, a version of you who no longer explains herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. You've stopped responding just because you're triggered. You now respond when you're ready, if at all. That kind of self-control. It's not just healing, it's transformation, and others feel it. They feel the difference in your energy. They sense they can't pull you into the old dance. They realize the version of you that once needed their presence or approval to feel whole no longer exists. You're moving forward not out of bitterness, but out of breakthrough, and that choice, to align your actions with your healing, is what silently tells the universe, I'm ready for better, and better always responds. You fall in love with your own becoming, and suddenly the focus shifts entirely. You're no longer obsessed with the timeline of when they might come back. You're not watching the door, waiting for a return, or reading between the lines of silence. You've moved into a new space, a space where your energy no longer revolves around their presence or absence. Now you're tuned into something far more powerful, your own growth, your own transformation, your own rise. This is where the healing deepens. Instead of asking, why haven't they reached out? You're asking, what lights me up today? You begin to reclaim your mornings, your thoughts, your time. The emotional real estate they once occupied starts to shrink, not out of anger, but because you have better things to fill it with, goals, dreams, passions. You start pouring into yourself in a way you used to pour into them, and it feels foreign at first. But soon it becomes freedom. You set new standards not as a reaction, but as a reflection of your evolution. The person you're becoming doesn't beg, she doesn't chase, she doesn't lower herself for breadcrumbs of affection. She radiates. She attracts, she leads herself with clarity, self-respect, and emotional discipline. Every choice you make now supports the version of you that is unfolding, not the version who is waiting for someone to come back. And in that unfolding, you discover things about yourself you had forgotten. The creativity you once silenced, the strength you didn't know you had, the fire in your spirit that no longer dims for anyone's comfort. You begin to realize that you're not rebuilding who you were. You're rising into someone you've never been before, someone wiser, someone freer, someone deeply rooted in her own worth. You don't need someone to come back to feel complete because you're finally falling in love with the process of becoming whole on your own. This kind of love, the one you give yourself now, it's fierce, it's soft, and it's sacred. You don't just say, I'm healing. You embody it, you live it, you become it, and the magnetic pull this creates, it's real. People sense it. The very energy they once took for granted now feels out of reach. Because you've leveled up, not to prove a point, but to honor your purpose. And from that place of self-devotion, miracles unfold, not because you were waiting, but because you were becoming. And becoming always attracts what's aligned, not what's familiar. So you continue to evolve, to elevate, to expand. You let the love you give yourself set the tone for every relationship in your life. And whether they return or not no longer defines your story. Because the most important reunion has already happened, the one between you and the woman you were always meant to be. You no longer wait, you choose. That's the moment your entire story begins to transform. There was a time when you sat in the in-between, hoping, wishing, watching, wondering if they would come back, if things would return to how they once were. You were suspended between the past and the future, unable to move forward because your heart was tethered to a version of the story that no longer existed. But now, that tie has loosened, that emotional limbo has turned into clarity. You realize you're not stuck. You're just one decision away from freedom, so you make it. You stop waiting. You start choosing. Waiting is passive. It places your power in someone else's hands. It says, my happiness depends on your return. But choosing is active. It reclaims your authority. It says, my peace is my responsibility. You begin to see that time doesn't heal everything. Choice does. The choice to stop rehearsing old conversations. The choice to stop checking your phone. The choice to stop romanticizing the version of love that required you to lose yourself, and most importantly, the choice to start showing up for you. When you choose, you start leading your life again. You make plans that don't include maybe. You build dreams that don't wait for someone to catch up. You surround yourself with people who pour into you, not drain you. You choose to believe that what's meant for you won't require you to abandon yourself in the process. You stop holding space for someone who stepped away and start creating space for what aligns with the version of you that's emerging. This shift doesn't come with fireworks, it comes with peace, the kind of peace that sits quietly in your chest and says, I'm okay now. You don't need answers. You don't need closure. You don't need a dramatic return to feel complete. You chose yourself, and in that choice you gave yourself everything you were waiting for from someone else: consistency, presence, love, protection. And here's what's powerful. When you move from waiting to choosing, you become unavailable to anything that disrupts your peace. The person you were waiting on may feel the difference. They may try to come back, not because you chased, but because your absence became louder than your presence ever did. But the beautiful thing, you're not waiting anymore. You're not stuck at the door. You've walked through it, and on the other side you've found a life, a self, a strength that was never lost, only waiting to be chosen by you. Before anything shifts in your external world, before they call, before they realize what they lost, before they even think about returning, you will have already transformed, and that's not just poetic language. It's reality. The moment you stop focusing on who walked away and start focusing on who you are becoming, the entire game changes. It's no longer about getting someone back. It's about getting yourself back. And that return is the most powerful one of all, because the truth is, no one truly comes back to you until you come back to you first. Every change begins internally, not with noise, not with proving, not with desperate action, but with stillness, awareness, and deliberate decisions. When you begin trusting your worth, breaking old patterns, protecting your energy, and making choices from a place of wholeness, you become a magnet for better. And whether or not the past finds its way back to you becomes less important. Why? Because you're no longer living in response to someone else's presence or absence. You're living in response to your inner alignment, and that's where real power lies. You've risen from someone who once waited, hoped, and questioned her value to someone who leads herself. You've stopped letting old versions of love define your future. You've taken control of your emotional narrative. You've started choosing rather than waiting, and you're no longer willing to lose yourself just to hold on to someone else. The person you've become, the one rooted in peace, clarity, and self-respect, isn't someone who begs for a return. She doesn't chase. She doesn't explain. She embodies the love she once thought she had to earn. So if someone comes back now, they're not returning to the same version of you. They're returning to someone evolved, someone elevated, someone who will no longer settle for less than what she deserves. And if they don't come back, that's no longer a tragedy, that's clarity, because the woman you've become won't accept anything that isn't in alignment with her healing, her future, and her standard. You've raised the bar, not out of ego, but out of experience. You now know that peace is more valuable than attention, and your growth is more sacred than anyone's return. This is your homecoming, not to a relationship, not to a memory, but to yourself. This change, the one that happens before anything returns, is the real miracle. You are no longer defined by who stays or who leaves. You are defined by the strength it took to choose yourself in a moment when you could have collapsed. And from this place of strength, anything is possible. Whether someone comes back or not, you're already whole, and that is the story worth living, that is the journey worth honoring, that is the energy that brings everything good back to you, because you stopped waiting and started becoming. Thank you so much for being here today. Your time, your energy, and your heart are never taken for granted. If this message stirred something in you, if it helped you see your own strength more clearly, then I'm honored to have been a part of that moment with you. Remember, your healing is not about them. It's about you coming back to the version of yourself that's grounded, powerful, and whole. You don't need to chase love, you are love. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've already survived so much, and now you rise. If this resonated with you, share it, revisit it when you need strength, and most importantly, live it. The change begins in you, and I believe with everything in me that you are ready. Until next time, stay grounded, stay powerful, and never forget, you are not waiting, you are becoming. Thank you, take care, and goodbye for now.